So today I'm going to cover public opinion and political barriers. And in the next class, we'll speak about individual behavior and social barriers. But I wanted to start today by going over some of the sections on economic policy evaluations that we didn't get to last class. So this is specifically the social welfare function approach and a real world example of the politics of selecting discount rates, the partisan politics of the social cost of carbon. And I just wanted to say that this material won't appear on the midterm, of course, but could appear on the final. So please do ask any questions you have. And then please feel free to email me with any questions as well, since I wasn't able to make the review session. Okay, so once we cover this, we'll also discuss some of the complexities of the climate change problem that make it a difficult perceptual problem and make the shaping of public opinion particularly challenging. And then we'll speak about polarization, disinformation campaigns, and politicization of climate change, public opinion and extreme weather events, and two theories that relate to this: distance and reasoning. And if we get to it, we'll speak about how public opinion then shapes public policy. And if we don't, we'll start next class with this. Okay, so I want to start with a quick recap, which will maybe be useful also in your few hours of exam prep. So just recall that the utility function translates an input. So this is an input here on the x-axis, normally measured in dollars, into a subjective value scale. And so this is what's measured here on the y-axis, and which we've called utils, but it could be called subjective value. And so the utility function is typically concave, which is this kind of curvy shape like this that makes a kind of little mountain. And what this shape does is it says that there's diminishing marginal utility of consumption. So this means that $1 in consumption is less valuable at a higher level of consumption or wealth than at a lower one. And the way you can see this is that the same increment out here in the flat part of the utility curve, when an individual is already at a higher level of consumption, translates into a lower marginal increase in utility, in subjective utility, than it does at a lower level of consumption here. So intuitively, $1 is worth more at low consumption or income levels than at already high levels of consumption. And so on the right, I have the discount function. And so generally, we're thinking about policies or decisions that unfold over long time horizons. So for example, an individual's lifetime or across many generations. And when people make decisions over long time horizons, they tend to discount the future. And that's what this beta parameter is. This is the discount rate. And with this shows is be worth only 70% as much in 100 days. And the value keeps decreasing over time. And a steeper curve would mean even steeper decreasing of the value over time. And so discounting your own future consumption might be a rational decision for many reasons. For one, the future is risky, whereas the value of consumption now isn't. But when applied to the intergenerational problem, we're making a decision about an ethical decision about how much to value the lives and security of future generations over long time horizons. And we'll see that there's no right answer here, and there are many debates about this. And this is something that becomes a very kind of politically driven decision. So I will not cover this again. We covered this last time. Today we're going to talk about the social welfare objective. So costs and benefits associated with environmental policies are spread over many people and generations. This raises a distributional dimension, which requires a way to trade off conflicting interests of different people. So who should bear the costs and who should receive benefits? The objectives of social welfare analysis is to summarize the costs and benefits to many people and to adjudicate among conflicting interests. And so there are two primary challenges, and this is time, so discounting, and inequality. So how costs are distributed across space or to different communities within a country. So a frequent practice in cost benefit analysis is to add up all the costs and benefits, dollar for dollar, into a net benefit kind of summary measure without worrying too much about how they're distributed. The assumption here is just that a dollar is a dollar. But this raises the question of whether a dollar is a dollar, of whether there's a difference between $100, for example, to a rich person or a poor person. So for example, think of a situation where we have a neighborhood that's willing to pay $1,000 to avoid pollution, and a rich one will pay 10 times as much. Where would we locate a polluting facility to minimize the costs? See, so there are these distributional issues that come up when we don't take into account that there are different abilities to pay and different sort of meanings or access to money in different populations. And so studies in the US find a correlation between the siting of toxin releasing facilities and the racial distribution or class composition of communities, in part because of policies like this. So how can we assign different values to dollars going to different people? So one way economists have done this is using the utility function. If we take the concave utility function from our earlier slide, we can use it to value a transfer of wealth from a rich person out here on the high wealth end of the curve to someone less well off down on the left of the curve. And so what we can see is transferring the same unit of wealth from a rich person to a poor person is going to increase the increment in utility more for a poor person. And so redistributing a dollar amount from rich to poor will increase the sum of utilities. And how curvy this function is determines a society's tolerance for inequality. So the curvier it is, the less tolerant inequality is, the more you would value redistributing the resources. Okay, so now if instead of summing up dollar costs and benefits, we adopt a social welfare function, we can include the subjective value associated with different levels of income or wealth through the utility function in our policy evaluation, and then sum these up instead. So the simplest social welfare function is just the sum of utilities. And again, the degree of curvature is going to represent how averse a society is to inequality. And so there are many possible modifications to this function. It doesn't have to be the sum. For example, the utility can have different shapes, and these will have different distributional implications. So there's still a lot of room for decision making here by the policy evaluator, by the economist. Okay, so we've started to address different views of function or income to different people. Another crucial dimension of environmental policies is their temporal dimension. So how do we value the costs and benefits that accrue to different generations? Our common practice here is to discount the future by a rate similar to the market interest rate, which hovers around 1% to 7%. And the decision at what rate to discount the future has huge implications for the estimated present value of implementing a policy, and really small differences in the discount rate can make huge differences in the present value. So for example, the present value, so consider $100 in 2030, and we're trying to understand what the present value of that is under different discount rates. If we take a discount rate of 1%, that would be worth only $90.50 in 2020. This is still calculated based on last year. If we take $100 in 2030, but we now apply a 7% discount rate, this would be worth only about $51 in 2020. So we can see that relatively small difference in the discount rate can dramatically change the present value of an amount of money in the future, of a benefit in the future. And so this has huge implications for policy decisions. Okay, and so we're going to speak through one of those. So in 2017, issues of time and inequality were front and center as the Trump administration began revising the social cost of carbon. Remember that the social cost of carbon is an estimate in dollars of the economic damages that would result from emitting 1 additional ton of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The Obama administration established the first federal social cost of carbon at $45 per ton. And scientists, to put this in perspective, scientists recently issued a report, I think came out in 2019, or maybe it was right before this was happening, but suggesting that the social cost of carbon should be in the range of $100 to $200. So it was already low. The EPA under Trump cut the federal social cost of carbon to $1 to $6 per ton, depending on how the calculation was made. And they did this in 2 ways. So they considered only domestic damages rather than global ones. So this limits the externalities they have to consider. They're no longer considering the externalities to the rest of the globe, to the rest of the planet. They're considering only the externalities, accounting for those costs in the United States. They also increased the rate at which we discount future benefits. And so they reference a guidance document from the Office of Management and Budget that's called the Circular A4, but overlook the sections about spatially and temporally distributed costs and benefits. So I'm just going to read that to you here. Where you choose to evaluate a regulation that is likely to have effects beyond the borders of the United States, these effects should be reported separately, and special ethical considerations arise when comparing benefits and costs across generations. Although most people demonstrate time preferences in their own consumption behavior, it may not be appropriate for society to demonstrate a similar preference when deciding between the well-being of current and future generations. Future citizens who are affected by such choices cannot take part in making them, and today's society must act with some consideration of their interests. Okay, so in 2021, the Biden administration reverted the social cost of carbon to the Obama era method of calculation, now estimated at $51 per ton. They also set up an interagency working group to deliver a more complete update in this coming January. Okay, so when did climate change become so partisan? So this image here is from its front page of the New York Times coverage of a 1988 it's from 1988, when James Hansen, the director of the NASA Institute for Space Studies, testified to the US Senate that greenhouse gases were causing global warming. And so he highlighted the threats posed by climate change. He mentioned the increase in extreme weather events, hurricanes, fires, and attributed it in part to the human exploitation of carbon energy sources. And so this statement brought significant public attention to the issue. There had been many concerns. There was an environmental movement that predated this, and a lot of it was about more local pollution, so pollution of local water systems, local air pollution. But this was one of the first times that global warming really became a public issue on a mass scale. And at the time of Hansen's report, so we can see this out here, this starts 1989, but just the year after this coverage, there was broad agreement across party lines on the threat posed by climate change. And so we can see that there's agreement and it's high. So on the left, it's worry about climate change. People who respond worrying about climate change a great deal or a fair amount. And on the right, people who believe the effects of global warming have already begun. So over time, we see an increasing divergence between Republicans and Democrats, with Republicans significantly less likely to view climate change as a threat or to believe it exists in the intervening years. And this data here ends at 2016. I'll show you some data, some more contemporary data points, but the trend in general continues, although there have been some recent positive increases on some measures where it sees that the gap is closing, especially on belief in global warming and belief in climate change. But there are others, for example, policy support, which we'll look at, where the gap has actually continued to widen. The other thing we can see here is that there are these years where you see increased concern. And so what happened here was the release of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth in 2006 and his Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And then we see a dip following the Great Recession, the financial recession of 2007, 2008. After that, we see a dip. And there are several papers associating this dip with people's concern for the economy and concern for their jobs. And so there's this notion that there's a sort of finite pool of worry or finite pool of attention that can be allocated across all these issues. And so people had other immediate crises come up. There's also subsequent work showing that this actually is most likely the effect of massive misinformation campaigns at this time, and we'll discuss those a little bit later in the class today. Okay, so globally, we also see that there's greater concern about climate change in countries other than the US, especially Latin America, Africa, and Europe. This figure shows low concern in China, and that's actually changed a bunch since this data was compiled. This is 2015 data, but I couldn't find a nice comparison of these continents or regions that was more up to date. So just the China figure has changed, but the rankings otherwise look very similar. So there's a strong negative relation between a nation's level of climate change concern and its carbon emissions per capita. And we'll speak a little bit about partisan mode of reasoning and vested interests and the role. So the individuals or the entities benefiting from the status quo have a vested interest. They are motivated to defend the current system. And so this seems to translate into concern as well. Okay, so environmental dilemmas and climate change more specifically have unique characteristics that make them a challenging problem. So we discussed some of these in the first class. So they're collective action problems. Individual incentives are misaligned with those of society. And they're also global collective action problems that require coordination across many countries. And the institutions we have to make binding agreements internationally or on a global scale are limited. And I believe you have a class coming up on governance where you'll most likely touch on some of those issues. They're also characterized by high levels of uncertainty. So for example, the attribution of extreme weather events to climate change is complicated, and you've studied some of the models that are used, and this is a relatively new science that is increasingly able to attribute these events to climate change, but this is still not something that the public does just on a day-to-day basis. This is also true with shifts in temperatures, which happen over, you need to aggregate information over a long sort of time scale to see those changes. There's also uncertainty about the efficacy of one's own actions, the severity of future impacts, and also because the cause and effect of one's actions today or policies today and the impacts in the future, it's hard to match one kind of policy or behavioral action to the impacts in the future. And they're also separated by a lot of time. And so this increases uncertainty. The impacts of climate change are also delayed in time and dispersed in space. And so they're largely borne by others. And these people are also most often not those in a position of power to make decisions about policies. These are often more vulnerable communities that will be more impacted, and also future generations where there's few institutions to represent the kinds of interests of future generations. There are also many different stakeholders with competing interests. So there will be winners and losers at many different levels. So there's, federal governments and international governments, states, corporations, communities, individuals, and all these entities will be impacted in different ways. There's also differential responsibility for historic and current emissions, and this is something you've discussed in previous classes. And then there's path dependency. So the production of high emitting industries are capital intensive, and this capital is long lived. And so this might mean that we have to retire productive assets earlier. There's also a lot of knowledge that's already been accumulated in the way that we currently do things. And so doing new things brings more risk with it. And of course, our contemporary life is highly dependent on fossil fuels currently. It doesn't need to be, but many things that we depend on, like food transportation, pumping water, cooling and heating homes, power for critical infrastructures, those things are highly dependent currently on fossil fuels. And then finally, there's polarization and politicization of the problem itself, which has eroded trust in science and created this debate about the role of anthropogenic factors. Okay, so we can see certain gaps. We can see reflections of this kind of complicated problem show up in these public opinion polls. So these are not separated by party now. And they still only go up to 2016. But the thing I wanted to point out is that you see trends where, for example, awareness of climate change or global warming here has grown from around 50% to about 4 in 5 people. But this doesn't necessarily translate into factual knowledge. So a majority of scientists, I think around 97%, agree that climate change is happening. But you see a much lower estimated percentage when you ask people if they agree with this statement, that most scientists agree global warming is happening. There's also substantial, let's see, this one. This one, I'm going to skip this for now. I just want to point out here, so in panel D, in the interest of time, that there's also very high support for certain policies. So this is support for the policy for a policy that states require 20% of electricity from renewables at a household cost of $100 per year. And there's much lower support, though, for taxes in general. And there's much lower support for policies as the price reflects a real price that a household would have to face. And so this isn't the most compelling figure here, but if you look at the Yale communications on climate change reports, they have these maps of the US that are completely red, where red indicates high support for renewables, subsidies for renewables, or subsidies for electric vehicles. And so these are very popular policies. And then you can look at the same thing for carbon taxes or for cap and trade type policies. And you see much more variation across the US. And even for the same policy, as the costs are really described in more detail, the cost to households, you also see that support diminish. Okay. So in general, we see more concern about climate change among women, among young populations. For other demographics, the results are mixed. There's some kind of interesting work on religion, for example, and climate change concern, but those vary a bit from study to study. People that have egalitarian worldviews tend to be more concerned about climate change. Individuals who have higher trust in scientists and climate change policy elites. And those who've been recently exposed to temperatures also show this temporary increase in concern about climate change, but this is very short-lived. So if you do surveys on days where the temperature is seasonally is higher than the normal for a particular season, you find that people are more concerned about climate change. And then the other thing that these studies find is that partisanship moderates everything. So returning to the issue of partisanship now, We see that the number of Americans who see climate change as a major threat is growing. This data now goes out until 2020. But we also see that these differences are largely due to an increase in concern among liberals. And so we see this concern, pretty high concern among liberals. We see some increase among moderate or liberal Republicans, and we see very little movement among conservative Republicans. And so this gap here, you can see, is also widening. This is different when you split out the Republican Party or even the Democratic Party by younger constituents. There you find pretty high concern among both groups, or pretty high acknowledgement that it's a major threat for the US. Okay, and so this difference, I mentioned this before, this difference gets bigger when we start looking at policy support and prioritization of policies. So the partisan gap between the percentage in each party who say climate change is a top priority has grown substantially. On the right, we see the difference, the Democrat minus Republican difference in support for federal spending along these many different issues that the American National Election Studies Survey considers. And what you see is that this gap in how much the different parties think should be spent is growing, and especially growing on the environment above all others. This is in part because there's a confluence of different value systems and worldviews map onto environmental problems in certain ways. And so, for example, Republicans tend to be anti-regulation and pro-individual freedoms, but addressing climate change requires government regulation, and it's a perceived infringement for many on individual freedoms. Republicans also tend to prioritize the health of the economy. And there's a common perception that the immediate costs needed, which are very large, that the immediate costs needed to address climate change come at the expense of the health of the economy. And so these differences in these ideological kind of value systems have been deliberately and strategically used and exaggerated by misinformation campaigns to kind of exaggerate the negative impacts of many of these policies. Okay, so in this figure, let's focus on the one on the right. These figures look at partisan differences over the effects of climate policies on the environment and the economy. So the one on the right is a little more striking, and what this shows is a really big difference between conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats in whether they think that policies that reduce, that are mitigation policies hurt the US economy. And so you see many more conservatives say that it would hurt the US economy. So they see this trade-off between these types of, between mitigation, between pro-environmental efforts and pro-economy or pro-labor efforts. And this is in part because of these misinformation campaigns, and the Green New Deal, which we discussed in the previous class, is going some way to reconciling these views by tying labor policy to environmental policies. And this is why it has been said to have some context bipartisan appeal, because it has broad progressive and intersectional goals. So the goals are sustainability, but also job creation and also equity. And this is done through massive public investment programs, spending on infrastructure projects, and job creation and retraining programs for those who will lose their jobs in the transition. Okay, so why do we see these growing divisions? In part, this is because of partisan information channels. And so there are many different types of informational cues that people use that have now become fractured among Republicans and Democrats. But I'm gonna start by explaining partisan motivated reasoning. So people tend to interpret information, the same information from the world differently, depending on their pre-existing worldviews and ideologies. This is driven in part by a desire to maintain consistency in your beliefs, by giving greater weight to evidence that supports the views, and spending more time refuting evidence that doesn't support those views or altogether ignoring that evidence. And over time, these ideological filters can become increasingly stable. They have sort of reinforcing mechanisms, in part because of the people we interact with and the news media that we consume. And so these are the next sections listed here. So people get their information from social and political elites, and they tend to believe elites from the same group. So these elites from the same group have been called information brokers. And there's some suggestion that when something is partisan, what you need is, for example, the issue of climate change, what you would need is a climate broker among Republicans to speak with Republicans. And similarly for Democrats, if there's an issue that you would like, that Republicans would like to convince Democrats of, you'd need an information broker from within the party. People also tend to assign credit to their same party and to blame the opposite party. And so we see this in studies of different kinds of messengers. So people tend to not blame co-partisans, people from their same party. But if it's someone from a different party, they're much harsher on those messengers in studies. People also get information from media and social networks. They often watch distinct news media outlets depending on their political ideologies. So for example, Fox News and NPR are seen as two media outlets on far ends of the political spectrum. And the news media frames the same story in very different ways, depending on its kind of partisan leaning. And the other thing is that people communicate with people in their social network, and will also tend to have social networks that include mostly people who are somewhat similar to them on some dimensions. And so that can reinforce these kinds of views. And then many of our values are learned or transmitted from generation to generation through social learning and through education from parents, from elders, also from schools. So beliefs are often transmitted in that direction, but you also see big kind of cohort differences. And so right now we're seeing millennials and even younger generations are much more concerned about the environment. And this is having impacts on their parents and grandparents who were less concerned. And so there are studies looking at how this kind of reverse learning and influence happens. And there just anecdotally, there are many CEOs who are climate action who reference their children as a driving force in why they're taking climate action. And finally, we can't ignore the impact of misinformation campaigns. And we'll return to this in just, I think, 2 slides. Okay. So partisanship and partisan filters on experience have also been growing in the US. So I'm just going to go over this figure really quickly. These are ratings from a feeling thermometer where people have to rate their in-party or their out-party. So Republicans rate Republicans as the in-party and they rate Democrats as the out-party on a scale of 0 to 100, which represents how much you can stand being around members of the other party, how much you like or respect this party. So there are different versions of the feeling thermometer. And what these studies show is that ratings of your own group, so this is the in-party, tend to be sort of stable over time, but ratings of the out groups, so how much people dislike people from the other party, have grown over time. There's this increased partisanship because people dislike people from the other party more. The figure on the right shows something similar. What it shows is that this difference between the in-group and out-group thermometer rating has been growing for Democrats and Republicans. There are 2 different measures, Democrats and Republicans, the party or members, not the party per se, but those have both been increasing. And what's notable here is that differences between white and Black Americans or Catholic and Protestant Americans have decreased over time. Okay, and so now for misinformation campaigns. So misinformation campaigns have been in the news more recently. In 2018, New York State sued Exxon for misrepresenting the financial risk of future climate policies to their shareholders. 2019, it was dismissed, but there are other similar suits in other states. So there's a recent report that found that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions since 1988. And 25 corporations and state-owned entities were responsible for more than half of global industrial emissions in that same period. So this concentration of industry creates these very strong and powerful interests that would like to preserve the status quo because that's they're benefiting from the current system. And these companies stand to lose from measures needed to address climate change. So these are for many oil and gas industry actors. So fossil fuel companies like Exxon or Koch Industries have formed lobbying groups and funded many conservative think tanks and politicians to kind of promote confusion and uncertainty about the existence of anthropogenic climate change specifically. So in 1989, a group of fossil fuel corporations and utilities and other actors formed the Global Climate Coalition to prevent the US adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, which was an international agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions. In its public statements, the coalition's official position was to claim that global warming was real, but it could be part of a natural warming trend and wasn't necessarily due to the activities of these companies or to the to anthropogenic causes. In 1998, Exxon, Chevron, and various conservative think tanks started a broad public relations campaign. The aim of this was to ensure recognition of the uncertainties of climate science. So just to say, this climate science is important, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around it, and to make this kind of the conventional wisdom. And so these companies have hired dubious experts to challenge scientific consensus. This is what they've called, people have called taking a balanced approach. They've brought in their own climate scientists. They promoted conspiracy theories, cherry-picked evidence, and created a narrative where addressing climate change hurts the economy. And so this is what we saw earlier playing out in those public opinion polls. And so, okay, I'm gonna skip that part. I'm going to skip this part on lobbying, and I'll, if we have time, come back to it next time and just continue on the public opinion. So public opinion, so we see these trajectories that look very fixed and a little bit sobering, but there are other public opinion metrics that look at within individuals over time, how consistent public opinion is on issues around climate. And what they find is that for many conservative respondents, respondents that are more towards the conservative end of the ideological spectrum, you see that there's much more flexibility in the view over time. And so this is just over, I think, a year, many different surveys looking at different at views of the same, I believe the same individuals over time, and they find that there's a lot of noise, which suggests that these opinions are malleable and they're undergoing some sort of change relative to people who are on the more liberal end of the ideological spectrum, where you see that the public opinion is much more stable over time. And this is another way of showing that the y-axis here is increased variability over time, and you see this increasing towards the conservative end of the ideological spectrum. Okay, so then given that public opinion is not what shapes public opinions. We've discussed cues from other actors and how these can shape public opinion. Another mechanism that people talk about a lot and that there's a lot of ongoing research about is experience with extreme weather events. In part, this is central. People are talking about this a lot because extreme weather events are increasing in frequency and severity. So we see this with the recent wildfires, for example. And there are theoretical reasons to think that direct experience is something that would increase concern about threats. So there's a literature on psychological distance. This is about how abstract or concrete a different threat appears to you along multiple dimensions. So this can be how far away in time the threat is, like we expect another pandemic in the future, but how far into the future? The spatial distance, this threat is happening, but it's happening somewhere else, like a war is happening in another country. It could happen here, but it's happening somewhere else. Social distance, this is how similar are the people being impacted to you. If they're very dissimilar, people tend to perceive a problem as more abstract and be less worried about it. And then hypothetical distance is the actual kind of probability of occurrence. But experience, for experience to impact your climate concern or action, it also has to be attributed to climate change for experience of extreme weather. And so it depends on people making this kind of causal attribution. And it's of course subject to the partisan motivated reasoning that we talked about. And so people can experience the same exact event very differently. And so there are many studies looking at for example, even temperature perceptions by farmers who believe in climate change or don't believe in climate change, and they report very different estimates of recent temperature patterns, or even people who experienced flooding will report it in very different ways depending on whether they believe in climate change or not. Okay, so here we see, 82% of Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say that climate change is affecting the community they live in. And people who live in Pacific regions, 72%, are more likely than those who live in mountain regions to say that climate change is affecting their community, right? So we see that areas more affected report that they are more affected by climate change, and that those who believe in climate change or are more concerned about climate change in general are also more likely to report this. But although more Democrats live in the Pacific region, these differences exist even after controlling for party, which means that even Republicans or independents in these regions are also reporting. They're also reporting this higher occurrence of and concern about extreme weather events. So this suggests that something is changing in the perception that these extreme weather events have some sort of impact. And this has led many people to ask, what might happen once these events become even more severe and more frequent, because they're going to hit a lot of areas that are predominantly Republican areas. And so, this is a projection, 2080, 2099, looking at climate-related costs of extreme weather events in different areas. But this is something that's prompted a lot of work on extreme weather, and also understanding how to encourage people to adapt in a way, even if they don't acknowledge that it's climate change related, how to adapt in a way that will be protective in the face of increasing extreme weather events. So this literature reports mixed results. So subjective experience doesn't always match the objective weather data. Prior beliefs and ideology can color that information. Experience doesn't necessarily translate into impact or perceived threat. So you might experience something but not be more worried. And negative experience can also help, and it can hurt. So it can also create, it can increase the salience or believability of these issues, but it can also create fear or denial or feelings of helplessness around these issues. We'll skip that part. Okay. And this is, I'm just going to end on this slide. So there's this paper that makes some suggestions about how we can take what we know about public opinion, polarization on public opinion, and experience of extreme weather events, and use this, how policymakers might use this. And the suggestions are that extreme weather event needs to be linked to climate change using effective messaging. So maybe climate brokers, using attribution science, which has evolved dramatically, that public opinion about adaptation and politics of adaptation is much less polarized. So it's easier to get credit for adaptation than mitigation as a politician. And so that creates an incentive to sort of sidestep climate change and focus on impacts of natural disasters. But there are many co-benefits and non-mutually exclusive efforts in adaptation policies that are also important for mitigation policies. And these can be from increasing trust in political actors, from benefiting from these types of policies and supporting more, but also more, concrete, like just actually overlapping policies or initiatives. And I will stop here and I'll pick up what we didn't get to at the beginning of next class.